So we know that World War II was rife with badasses, all sorts of badasses. Medal of Honor recipients, guys who sacrificed their lives for the sake of others, guys who were one-man wrecking crews against the enemy. The list of top 10 American badasses could extend into the thousands, actually the tens of thousands, but we've narrowed it down to the top 10 American badasses. I'm not going to lay out the criteria, it's a subjective list, but hopefully this will encourage you to do some additional Googling on these amazing heroes to learn more. At number 10, Calvin Graham. So you probably didn't think you'd see a 12-year-old on this list, right? Well, think again. His name is Calvin Graham, and he may be the toughest kid in American history, certainly the biggest 12-year-old badass ever. What did he do? Well, try this on for size. He turns 12, Pearl Harbor is attacked, and so he decides he's going to run away from home and join the war. He tells his mother he's visiting family in California, and he actually enlists in the Navy instead. The kid forges his mother's signature, then he blackmails a Navy dentist who quickly figures out he's only 12 because he has all of his baby teeth. Young Calvin somehow manages to get assigned to the USS South Dakota, and he fights in two of the most important naval battles of the Pacific Theater, including the Sea Battle of Guadalcanal, which in my estimation was arguably the second most important sea battle after Midway. It's there that he really cements his legend as badass. So he's manning machine gun and dusting Japanese Zeros when he takes shrapnel to the mouth, has all of his teeth knocked out, and he's bleeding profusely. What does he do? He refuses medical attention in order to tend to the wounded and dying around him, and is actually credited with saving several lives. Calvin earns the Purple Heart, the youngest American in history, by the way, to receive that honor. And how is he rewarded for his heroics? Well, his mom actually gets wind of him being in the Navy through newsreel coverage, and she turns him in, she rats him out. He gets thrown in the brig, which is not a good experience, by the way, and eventually dishonorably discharged, which means he's stripped of all medical benefits, among other things. Look, Calvin is truly one of the most extraordinary characters of the Second World War, there's no doubt about it. We did a longer video on him, link in the description box below, but really check it out. It's worth learning about this guy. His life was just much more than just World War II, and he's an amazing character. I mean, really, can you imagine a 12-year-old today doing that? No, I can't either. So from the youngest to possibly the oldest in Jimmy Stewart at number 9. So if you're surprised to see the actor on this list, then clearly you haven't watched our longer video on him, link in the description box. But I'm going to give you 5 reasons why he is a bona fide badass. First, Jimmy enlisted after he won the Academy Award for the movie Philadelphia. That's right, he was one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood when he decided to enlist, and that's a full 9 months before Pearl Harbor. You heard me right, this is March of '41, before Pearl Harbor. Second reason, Jimmy insisted on seeing combat when he learns that the Army Air Force simply wanted to use him for bond tours and publicity. He says no way to that. He wants to see action. It's the only time he actually uses his star power to pull rank, to demand to see combat. Now that is badass. Reason 3, not only does Jimmy see combat, but it's some of the most dangerous combat of the war. He's a B-17 bomber pilot in the 8th Air Force, which, to put it into perspective, the 8th Air Force suffers more casualties, 50,000, than the entire Marine Corps during World War II. Now that's a lot. Being a bomber pilot is one of the most hazardous jobs of the war, with a 20% kill rate. That means that statistically, you're dead after 5 runs, and he made 25 runs that we know of, and probably more. Again, this is badass stuff. Fourth reason, he's not just a good pilot, he's actually a great pilot, and is considered one of the best leaders in the 8th Air Force. He gets promoted multiple times, and by the end of the war, he's Chief of Staff of the 2nd Air Division of the 8th Air Force. This guy is no show pony, he is a legitimate military star. And finally, the Army wants to publicize his heroics And he absolutely refuses. He never brags, he never talks about it, he never preens. He suffers PTSD and he suffers it in silence. If you watch It's a Wonderful Life, you could literally see him having a nervous breakdown on camera. Like Calvin Graham, can you imagine anyone in Hollywood today doing what Jimmy did? No, you can't, not by a long shot. Number 8, Dorie Miller. So if you've seen the movie Pearl Harbor or you regularly watch our shorts, you know about Dorie Miller. He was the cook turned gunner aboard the USS West Virginia on the morning of Pearl Harbor. Look, here's a guy who never shot an anti-aircraft gun in his life, and as the West Virginia is under attack, he leaps into action and mans one of the guns where he shoots down, by some accounts, either 1 or 4 Japanese planes. There's some discrepancy there. He also helped save a bunch of his fellow sailors and is one of the last to leave the West Virginia before it sinks. He received the Navy Cross that day, the first African American in history to receive that honor, and it probably should have been the Medal of Honor. In fact, there's still a campaign to have it posthumously awarded to him. He deserves it. So he's sent back to the United States to do some war bomb promotions, but he insists on going back into combat in the Pacific. Tragically, Dorie would not survive the war. He's killed in 1943 when the ship that he was on was torpedoed by a Japanese sub. Look, I really do hope Dorie receives the Medal of Honor posthumously. He deserves it. So number 7, Chuck Yeager. Just that name alone sounds badass. Chuck Yeager. Chuck might be the dictionary definition of badass. They just don't make men like him anymore. Now, most Americans know him for being a test pilot, which he was, the first man to break the sound barrier, and arguably the greatest test pilot in American history. He was immortalized in the movie The Right Stuff, and probably should have been an astronaut, but was rejected because he didn't have a college degree. What's lesser known about Chuck is that he was also a double ace and an absolute stud during World War II. He had 12 kills during the war, and nearly half of those were against German jets. In fact, Chuck liked to joke that the first jet he ever saw, he shot down, which I love. He was also an ace in a day, downing 5 German fighters in one day, a very rare feat. That alone gets you badass status in my book. And Chuck was actually shot down over France, and with the assistance of the French underground, was able to return to England. He actually got permission directly from Ike himself to fly again. Typically back then, once a pilot was shot down and returned, they didn't let him fly again because they didn't want to reveal the strength of the underground and the assistance. But he went right to Ike, pestered him, and started flying again. Again, that is badass stuff. And oh, by the way, he flew over 100 missions in Vietnam as well. True story. This was after his illustrious test pilot and NASA career. Again, this is badass stuff. Chuck Yeager. Number 6, Pappy Boyington. Come on, you didn't really think we'd leave Pappy off this list, did you? I know the comments already. Why Pappy over Joe Foss or Richard Bong, who both had more kills than Pappy? Well, this is a badass list. And like Chuck Yeager, Pappy is the textbook definition of a badass. Everything about the guy, from his hard drinking, to his rule breaking, to doing things his own way, he just screams badass. And it's not like he wasn't a great pilot. He was credited with 28 kills between his time in China with the Flying Tigers and in the South Pacific with the Marines. And don't forget, he was awarded both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross and spent the final 20 months of the war as a Japanese POW, along with badass honorable mention Richard O'Kane and Louis Zamperini of Unbroken fame. Of course, it doesn't hurt that Pappy was immortalized by the show Black Sheep Squadron, one of my all-time favorite shows. They really should reboot that series. It was fantastic. I get the sense that Pappy would have been a badass even if there was no war. That's just the way he was. So number 5, everybody's favorite big brother, Dick Winters. Of all the men on the list, perhaps none are as revered and respected by his men than Dick Winters. He's not a badass in the Chuck Yeager or Pappy Boyington sense of the word, but he's still a badass in my book. Look, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with Dick Winters from either Band of Brothers, the book, or the HBO series, so I'm not going to chronicle all of his exploits with the legendary Easy Company. And if you're not familiar with him, pause this video, go binge watch Band of Brothers, and then come back. Look, put simply, he's a different type of badass, a badass leader. How he led his men through D-Day, then Basilone, always putting his men first, downplaying his own heroics. That's why he is so beloved by his men. And by the way, the assault at Brecourt Manor remains a textbook example of small unit tactics in overcoming a larger enemy force, which is very cool. So a frequent question is, why didn't he receive the Medal of Honor? And the answer is that he was put forward for it for Brecourt Manor, but it was downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross because they had an informal rule of not putting forward more than one Medal of Honor per division. There's a movement afoot to get him the Medal of Honor posthumously, and hopefully that will be successful. He absolutely deserves it. This is where it gets a little dicey. Any one of these guys could be number one in my book, but let's start with Matt Urban. He's probably not the household name as our other remaining three. In fact, I know he's not, but trust me, if you've seen our longer video on Matt Urban, link in the description box below, you'll agree with me that he could easily be number one, easily. Because of a paperwork snafu, he actually didn't receive his Medal of Honor until 30 years later, and at the ceremony, President Jimmy Carter called him the greatest soldier in American history. Now look, that doesn't mean he actually is the greatest soldier in American history, but when a president says that, that's pretty badass stuff. Urban is actually the second most decorated soldier after Audie Murphy, and their stories are very similar in that they performed heroically throughout the war, not just in one particular engagement. His heroics are way too long for this video. Again, watch our longer video on him. But one incident really stands out if you want to understand his next level badassery. He was wounded pretty badly following the D-Day landings, so much so that he's sent back to England to recuperate in a hospital after multiple surgeries. So while recuperating in a hospital in England, he learns that his unit is stuck in the hedgerows of France and suffering huge casualties. So what does he do? He actually breaks out of the hospital, sneaks on a steamer to France, then hitchhikes his way to Saint-Lô, and just in the nick of time, he actually leads a counter-assault against the German offensive and saves the day. Mind you, he's doing this with a bad limp. He's still wounded. And oh, by the way, did I mention he earned 7 Purple Hearts? 7, the most of anyone during World War II. In addition to the Medal of Honor and every other award under the sun, the Germans nicknamed him the Ghost because he simply wouldn't die. Like I said, total badass. Could easily be number one on the list. Again, check out our longer video on him. Trust me, it's worth it. Okay, so number 3, Desmond Doss. Like Dick Winters, Doss is clearly a different type of badass, but a badass nonetheless. It's not often you call a pacifist and a conscientious objector a badass, but he absolutely is. His heroism and bravery is truly off the charts. His exploits have been chronicled in the movie Hacksaw Ridge, so I'm not going to go into it. But the fact that the movie had to actually downplay his heroics because it would come off as too unbelievable says everything you need to know about Desmond Doss. That to me is amazing, that Hollywood had to water down his exploits because even they thought it'd be too unbelievable. And it's also important to note, he was truly a conscientious objector, meaning he refused to carry a gun but insisted on being in combat. In this case, a medic. You know, we did a short video on him, and there were many comments comparing him to Alvin York from World War I. But there really aren't that many similarities because York carried a gun and actually killed a dozen Germans and publicly renounced his objection to the war, while Doss was committed to not carrying a weapon the entire war. His heroics at Okinawa, saving upwards of 100 men while dodging enemy fire, may be the guttiest display of bravery in World War II. It's just mind-numbing how gutsy he was, not just in Okinawa, by the way, but also at Guam and the Philippines, where he earned 2 Bronze Stars. You know, the movie Hacksaw Ridge doesn't even mention those campaigns amazingly. But thanks to that movie, his story is really well known and familiar, and it should be. He's one of the most impressive heroes in American history. Okay, before we get to the final 2, some honorable mentions that we have to talk about. Guys who could easily have been in the top 10, but didn't quite make the cut. So let's start with Jake McNeese. the demolition expert with the 101st Airborne. His nickname was McNasty, which about sums him up. Truly one of the most badass characters of the war. In fact, the Fat Electrician did an awesome video on him. Check it out. I'll put a link in the description box. In fact, his exploits were the basis for the movie The Dirty Dozen. Joe Foss, a Marine ace with 26 kills, I mentioned him earlier, Medal of Honor recipient, became the governor of South Dakota, the first commissioner of the AFL Football League, and the president of the NRA. Pretty badass guy. Admiral Richard O'Kane, I also mentioned him, considered the greatest sub-commander in U.S. history, Medal of Honor recipient, and a POW. Look this guy up. Bomber pilot Jay Zemer, one of the legendary Yeager Beavers. We did a short video on him. Definitely check that out. Pure guts that guy was. And look up a guy named Garland Connor. We did a short on him. This badass actually ordered an artillery strike on his own position. Look, we could have also included Hollywood stars like Eddie Albert, Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson. We did videos of all of them. All were legitimate badasses, as you know. And then there was Jack Lucas, the 17-year-old Marine who jumped on 2 live grenades. I mean, that to me is amazing. Look, there were many, many more. We could have done thousands of badasses. This videos would go on forever. But those are a few of the honorable mentions. Okay, so number 2 and 1 are truly interchangeable. I know that this will be met with a lot of comments, and that's fine. That's the whole point of this video, to honor these amazing heroes and to hopefully encourage additional research into their extraordinary service. But I have Audie Murphy at number 2. Look, I know many of you will be shocked by that he's not number 1, but when I reveal who number 1 is, it'll make a little bit more sense. Look, when I was growing up, Audie Murphy was a household name. I feel like younger generations today don't really know who he was, but people of a certain age absolutely know that he was the most decorated man of World War II. Again, his story and heroics are well known. I'm not going to recite it all here, but the movie To Hell and Back and his subsequent career in Hollywood really cemented his legend. We'll probably do a longer video on Audie someday. It requires a full hour just to scratch the surface on everything he did during World War II. Look, I love Audie as much as the next guy. Like I said, he could easily be number 1, and for many of you, he is number 1, and that's totally fine. I'm not going to argue with it. But if you've seen my longer video on John Basilone, then you know why I have him as the number 1 badass of World War II. And it's not just because he was a paisano from Jersey, though that does help. Look, the thing that does it for me with Basilone is that he insisted on going back into combat after earning the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal and going back to the Pacific, which was just brutal. Now that is badass stuff when you want to go back. If you want a full rundown on his exploits, check out our longer video we did on him, link in the description box below. Or check out the series The Pacific, which he was one of the primary characters. Look, Basilone is truly one of the most extraordinary men in American military history. He's arguably the greatest Marine in history, probably with the exception of his mentor, Chesty Puller. He is beyond revered within the Marine Corps, and while he's no longer a household name, for a long time following World War II, he really was. Look, what he did at Guadalcanal, one of the most gruesome and bloodiest battles of the war, holding off hundreds of Japanese over 3 sleepless nights, literally single-handedly, is just the stuff of legend and earned him the Medal of Honor. Again, watch our longer video to get the details. It's truly mind-numbing what he went through to hold the line, including at one point hand-to-hand combat. They sent him back to the States for war bond tours, which was pretty standard stuff for Medal of Honor recipients. But what is not standard stuff is the person insisting on going back into combat, which Basilone did. In fact, the military frowned upon that stuff, but Basilone insisted. He pestered the Marine Corps brass to send him back, and finally they relented, and they sent him back to Iwo Jima, where he earns a Navy Cross for his heroics that day. And he dies there. It just as easily could have been a second Medal of Honor. Like I said, he was featured in the HBO series The Pacific, and as great as that series was, I'm not sure it does justice as to how much of a badass Basilone really was. So there you have it, our top 10 list of biggest American badasses during World War II. We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts and lists in the comment section below. Tell us what we got right, what we got wrong, and what you think. I'll talk to you soon.